I was standing in my tiny backyard last spring, staring at a bare fence that got full sun, and I had this realization that completely changed how I grow food. I had maybe 12 square feet of ground space, but I had over 60 square feet of vertical space just sitting there doing nothing. That's when I discovered that some of the most productive edible plants aren't sprawling ground crops at all. They're climbing vines that can turn any wall, fence, or trellis into a vertical farm. And here's what nobody tells you. The best ones are perennials, meaning you plant them once and they produce food for years, sometimes decades. Welcome to Garden Solace, where we help you grow more food in less space. I'm about to share 10 incredible perennial climbing vines that are absolutely perfect for small gardens, balconies, and tight spaces. These aren't your typical vegetables. These are plants that will come back year after year, climbing upward instead of spreading outward, and producing food you can harvest from spring through fall. And if you stick around until the end, I'll reveal which vine produced over 40 pounds of food from just one plant in my small garden last year. So go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment below telling me what you're currently growing vertically. Let's dive in. Hack number 1, passion fruit vine, Passiflora edulis, the tropical powerhouse. Let me start with one of the most exciting perennial climbers I've ever grown, the passion fruit vine. Now, I know what you're thinking. Isn't that a tropical plant? And you're right, but here's what changed everything for me. There are actually cold hardy varieties like Passiflora incarnata, also called maypop, that can survive down to zone 5, and the traditional purple passion fruit thrives in zones 9 through 11. I planted my first passion fruit vine 3 years ago along a south-facing fence, and I have to tell you, watching this plant grow was like witnessing something from a science fiction movie. Within the first season, my vine climbed over 15 feet, covering an 8-foot section of chain link fence with these gorgeous, intricate flowers that look like something from another planet. But here's where it gets really good. Each vine started producing fruit in its second year, and by year 3, I was harvesting between 60 and 80 passion fruits per season from just 2 plants. We're talking about fruits that sell for $3 to $5 each at specialty stores. I actually tracked my harvest last year, and from just those 2 vines taking up maybe 4 square feet of ground space, I got the equivalent of about $240 worth of passion fruit. The growing process is surprisingly straightforward. I planted mine in well-draining soil amended with compost, and I installed a simple trellis made from cattle panel fencing, which cost me about $20 for an 8-foot section. Passion fruit vines need full sun, at least 6 hours, and they're hungry feeders, so I fertilize monthly during the growing season with a balanced organic fertilizer. The flowers are self-pollinating in most cases, but I noticed I got better fruit set when I hand-pollinated with a small paintbrush, which takes maybe 5 minutes every few days. The fruits ripen about 80 days after flowering, and you know they're ready when they turn deep purple and start to wrinkle slightly. The flavor is intensely tropical, tart and sweet at the same time, and I use them in everything from smoothies to desserts to cocktails. One of the best benefits is that these vines are relatively pest-free in my experience, and the flowers attract tons of beneficial insects and pollinators to the garden. Hack number 2, hardy kiwi, Actinidia arguta, the cold climate fruit factory. Now let's talk about a vine that completely surprised me with its productivity, the hardy kiwi. This is not the fuzzy kiwi you buy at the grocery store. This is Actinidia arguta, and it's one of the most underrated fruiting vines for small spaces. I was skeptical when I first planted 2 vines, one male and one female, because I'd read they take 3 to 5 years to produce, but when they finally started fruiting in year 4, I understood why people call them fruit factories. These smooth-skinned, grape-sized kiwis are incredibly sweet. You eat the whole thing, skin and all, and the flavor is even better than store-bought kiwis. Here's what makes hardy kiwi perfect for vertical gardens. The vines are extremely vigorous and can grow 15 to 20 feet in a single season once established. I trained mine along a pergola structure in my side yard, and they've created this beautiful edible canopy that provides shade in summer while producing massive amounts of fruit. Last season, which was year 6 for my vines, I harvested over 100 pounds of fruit from just 2 plants. I'm not exaggerating. I actually weighed the harvest because I couldn't believe it myself. These vines are hardy from zones 4 through 8, which means they can handle serious cold, down to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. The key to success with hardy kiwi is understanding that you need both male and female plants for pollination. The ratio is typically 1 male for every 8 females, but in a small garden, I'd recommend just planting 1 of each. I spaced mine about 10 feet apart and built a simple but sturdy support system using 4x4 posts and heavy gauge wire, because these vines get heavy when loaded with fruit. The soil needs to be rich and well-draining, with a slightly acidic pH between 5 and 7. I mulch heavily around the base with wood chips to keep the roots cool and moist, and I water deeply once a week during dry spells. Pruning is essential and happens twice a year. I do a heavy prune in late winter to control the size and shape, tutting back to the main framework, and then I do light pruning in summer after harvest to remove excessive growth. The fruits ripen in September and October in my Zone 7 garden, and here's a cool trick. You can harvest them slightly underripe and let them ripen at room temperature, which extends your harvest window. The vines are relatively pest and disease resistant, though Japanese beetles sometimes nibble the leaves, but it's never been enough to impact production. Hack number 3, hops, Humulus lupulus, the craft beer's dream climber. If you're into craft beer or just want one of the fastest growing edible vines on the planet, you need to know about hops. I planted my first hop rhizomes 5 years ago, and these plants have become some of my favorite perennials in the entire garden. Hops are hardy from zones 3 through 8, and what makes them absolutely perfect for vertical gardens is their incredible growth rate. I'm talking about growing 6 inches per day during peak season. My hop vines, that's what they're called, not vines, because they climb by wrapping their stems rather than using tendrils, reach heights of 20 to 25 feet every single summer, and then they die back completely to the ground in winter. The edible part is the cone-shaped flowers that appear in late summer, and these are what give beer its distinctive bitter flavor and aroma. But even if you don't brew beer, hops shoots are incredible edible vegetable that's considered a delicacy in parts of Europe. In early spring, when the new shoots emerge, you can harvest some of them and saute them with asparagus. They have this unique, slightly bitter, herbaceous flavor that's absolutely delicious with butter and garlic. I harvest about 2 pounds of hop shoots every April, and they sell for up to $20 per pound at farmers markets because so few people know about them. The growing process is surprisingly slow. I planted rhizomes in early spring about 4 inches deep in well-amended soil with excellent drainage. These plants need full sun, at least 6 hours, and a strong vertical support system. I use heavy twine or wire running from ground level up to a horizontal cable at about 18 feet high. In the first year, the plants establish their root systems and might only grow 10 to 12 feet, but from year 2 onward, they're absolute monsters. I cut all the growth back to the ground in late fall after the first hard frost, and I mulch the crown with about 6 inches of compost and leaves. By spring, new shoots emerge, and I select the 3 to 5 strongest ones per plant and train them clockwise up their support strings. The hot cones are ready to harvest in late August through September when they feel papery and dry, and when you rub them, they release that distinctive hoppy aroma. Last year, I harvested about 4 pounds of dried hops from 3 plants, which is enough to brew approximately 40 batches of 5-gallon beer, saving me hundreds of dollars. Even if you don't brew, dried hops make wonderful aromatic additions to sleep pillows and herbal sachets. Hack number 4, Scarlet runner beans, Phacelia coccineus, the beautiful and delicious multi-purpose vine. Let me tell you about one of the most versatile and visually stunning edible climbers you can grow, scarlet runner beans. Now, technically, these are often grown as annuals, but here's the secret that most gardeners don't know. In zones 7 through 10, the tuberous roots are actually perennial and will come back year after year in my zone 7 garden. I've had the same scarlet runner bean plants returning in my zone 7 for 4 years now, and each year they produce more abundantly than the last. These vines are absolutely absolutely gorgeous with bright red-orange flowers that hummingbirds absolutely go crazy for, and they'll climb anywhere from 6 to 12 feet in a single season. What makes scarlet runner beans so perfect for small vertical gardens is that you get multiple harvests from one plant. You can harvest the young pods when they're 6 to 8 inches long and cook them like regular green beans. They have a slightly meatier texture and a wonderful flavor. If you let the pods mature, you can shell out the beans and use them fresh like limas, or let them dry completely for storage. And here's what really surprised me. The tuberous roots are actually edible too, similar to a small potato, though I usually leave mine in the ground to ensure they come back each spring. Last season, from just 6 plants growing up a simple bamboo teepee structure in my raised bed, I harvested about 15 pounds of pods over a 3-month period. Growing scarlet runner beans is incredibly easy, which is why I recommend them for beginning gardeners. I planted the seeds directly in the ground after the last frost date, about 1 inch deep and 6 inches apart at the base of my support structure. These beans prefer cooler temperatures than regular pole beans, so they're perfect for spring and fall growing in warmer zones. They need full sun but can tolerate some light shade, especially in hot climates. The soil needs to be rich and well-draining, and I always inoculate the seeds with rhizobium bacteria before planting, which helps them fix nitrogen and improves yields. I installed a simple teepee made from 8-foot bamboo poles tied at the top, which cost me maybe $10 and took 15 minutes to construct. The vines climb readily and don't need much help, though I do guide them initially. I water consistently, about 1 inch per week, and I mulch around the base to keep the roots cool. The flowers start appearing about 60 days after planting, and then it's non-stop blooms and beans until frost. I harvest pods every 2 to 3 days to encourage more production, and the more you pick, the more they produce. In fall, after the first frost kills the foliage, I cut the vines back to ground level and mulch heavily over the root area, with about 8 inches of leaves and compost. Come spring, new shoots emerge from the tubers, and the cycle starts again. Hack number 5. Malabar Spinach, Bacella alba, the heat-loving leafy green. If you live in a hot climate or you're tired of your leafy greens bolting in the summer heat, Malabar spinach is going to change your gardening game completely. This is actually not a true spinach at all. It's a tropical vine that produces thick, succulent leaves that taste similar to spinach, with a slightly peppery note. I started growing Malabar spinach 3 years ago in my Zone 7 garden. And while it's technically a perennial in zones 10 and 11, I've had success overwintering the tuberous roots indoors in pots and replanting them each spring. This vine absolutely thrives in heat and humidity, producing abundantly when regular spinach would have bolted months ago. The growth habit of Malabar spinach is what makes it perfect for vertical growing. The vines can reach 10 to 20 feet in a single season, climbing enthusiastically up any support you provide. I grow mine on a simple cattle panel trellis along my fence, and it creates this beautiful, dense wall of glossy green or red-purple leaves, depending on the variety. What really impressed me was the productivity. From just 3 plants, I was able to harvest about 2 to 3 pounds of leaves every single week from June through October. That's roughly 60 pounds of greens from 3 vines, taking up less than 6 square feet of ground space. Compare that to traditional spinach, which might give you 1 or 2 harvests before it bolts. Growing Malabar spinach is straightforward once the weather warms up. This is definitely a heat-loving plant, so I don't plant it outside until soil temperatures are consistently above 70 degrees Fahrenheit, usually late May in my area. I start seeds indoors about 6 weeks before the last frost, or you can direct seed once it's warm enough. The soil needs to be rich and moisture-attentive because these vines are thirsty. I amended my planting area heavily with compost, and I installed a drip irrigation line to keep them consistently watered. The support structure needs to be sturdy because the vines get surprisingly heavy. I harvest by pinching off the growing tips and young leaves, which encourages branching and more leaf production. The key is to never strip all the leaves from one section. I take a few leaves from multiple areas of the vine to keep it healthy and productive. In late summer, the vines produce small flowers followed by dark purple berries that look like tiny grapes. These berries are edible, though somewhat seedy, but I usually let them ripen and fall to the ground because they reseed readily. Before the first frost, I dig up the tuberous roots, which look like small sweet potatoes, and I store them in barely moist peat moss in my basement at around 50 degrees. In spring, I pop them up indoors about 6 weeks before the last frost, and once they start growing, I transplant them back outside. The leaves are incredibly nutritious, high in vitamins A and C, iron, and calcium, and I use them raw in salads when young or sautéed like spinach when they're more mature. Hack number 6. Grapes, Vitis species, the classic vertical fruit. I can't talk about perennial edible vines without discussing grapes, one of the most productive and longest-lived fruiting plants you can grow. I know grapes might seem complicated or intimidating, but I'm here to tell you that growing them in a small vertical space is not only possible, it's incredibly rewarding. I planted 4 grapevines 6 years ago along my back fence, and they've become one of the most productive parts of my entire garden. Last season alone, I harvested over 120 pounds of grapes from those 4 vines, and we're talking about plants that take up maybe 16 square feet of ground space total, while covering over 100 square feet of vertical fence. The beauty of grapes for vertical gardens is that they're incredibly adaptable to different training systems. I use a simple modified cordon system where I trained 2 horizontal arms from each vine along heavy gauge wire attached to my fence posts, and all the fruiting canes grow vertically from those horizontal arms. There are great varieties that will grow in zones 3 through 10, so no matter where you live, there's likely a variety that will thrive in your climate. I grow Concord grapes, which are incredibly cold-hardy to zone 4, and they have that classic grape flavor that makes amazing juice, jelly, and fresh eating. Other varieties I recommend for different purposes include Himrod for fresh eating, a seedless variety that's sweet and crisp, or Marquette if you're interested in winemaking, which is one of the best cold-hardy wine grapes available. Setting up a grapevine properly is crucial for long-term success, so let me walk you through exactly what I did. I planted bare root vines in early spring, digging holes about twice as wide and deep as the root system. The soil needs to be well-draining. Grapes hate wet feet, so I amended heavy clay areas with compost and sand. I installed a support system using 4x4 posts every 8 feet with 3 strands of 12-gauge wire at 2, 4, and 6 feet high. In the first year, I let the vine establish and selected the strongest cane to become the permanent trunk, removing all other growth. In year 2, I trained that trunk vertically to the middle wire and then created 2 horizontal arms or cordons running along that wire in opposite directions. From year 3 onward, all my pruning focuses on maintaining those cordons and managing the fruiting canes that grow from them. The critical thing to understand is that grapes produce fruit on 1-year-old wood, meaning canes that grew last season. So every winter I prune heavily, removing about 90% of the previous year's growth and leaving only short spurs with 2 to 3 buds each. This seems extreme, but it's essential for good fruit production. Grapes need full sun, at least 8 hours for best fruiting, and consistent watering, about 1 inch per week, especially during fruit development. I fertilize in early spring with a balanced organic fertilizer and mulch heavily with wood chips to keep the roots cool. The flowers start appearing about 60 days after planting, and then it's non-stop blooms and beans until frost. I harvest pods every 2 to 3 days to encourage more production, and the more you pick, the more they produce. In fall, after the first frost kills the foliage, I cut the vines back to ground level and mulch heavily over the root area with about 8 inches of leaves and compost. Come spring, new shoots emerge from the tubers and the cycle starts again. Hack number 7. Arctic Kiwi, Actinidia colomicta, the ornamental edible with incredible foliage. While we're on the subject of kiwis, I have to tell you about Arctic kiwi, which is even more cold-hardy than hardy kiwi I mentioned earlier. And it comes with a visual bonus that makes it one of the most beautiful vines in my entire garden. Arctic kiwi, or Actinidia colomicta, is hardy down to zone 3, which means it can survive temperatures as low as -40 degrees Fahrenheit. But what really sets this plant apart is the foliage on the male plants. The leaves develop this incredible variegation with splashes of pink and white, especially on the tips, that looks like someone painted them with watercolors. When I first saw my male Arctic kiwi develop its variegation in its 3rd year, I actually thought something was wrong with it until I realized this was a desirable feature. The fruits on Arctic kiwi are smaller than hardy kiwi, about the size of a large grape, but the flavor is outstanding, sweet and aromatic with hints of tropical fruit. They ripen earlier than hardy kiwi, usually in August in my garden, and you can eat them whole, skin and all. Like hardy kiwi, you need both male and female plants for fruiting, and I planted 1 male and 1 female about 8 feet apart. The female produces the fruit, while the male has the showy foliage and provides pollen. From my single female vine, which is now 5 years old, I harvested about 10 pounds of fruit last season. That might not sound like a ton compared to some of the other vines I've mentioned, but these fruits are intensely flavorful, and because they're so rare, they're incredibly special. Growing Arctic kiwi is similar to hardy kiwi in many ways, but there are some important differences. These vines are less vigorous, typically growing 8 to 12 feet per season, rather than 15 to 20 feet of hardy kiwi, which actually makes them more manageable in small spaces. I grow mine on a simple wooden trellis attached to the side of my shed, and it's created this gorgeous living wall that serves as both food production and ornamental feature. The support structure doesn't need to be as heavy-duty as for hardy kiwi, but it still needs to be sturdy. I use 2x4s for the frame, with wire mesh for the vines to climb. Arctic kiwi prefers slightly acidic soil, pH between 5 and 6.5, and it needs consistent moisture but excellent drainage. I planted mine in a raised bed amended with peat moss and compost. These vines bloom in late spring with small, fragrant white flowers. And here's an important tip. Male Arctic kiwis don't develop their showy variegated foliage until they're about 3 years old and sexually mature, so be patient if you're growing them partly for ornamental value. Pruning is less intensive than hardy kiwi. I do a light prune in late winter to remove dead or crossing branches and to control size, and then I might do some light summer pruning if it gets too unruly. The fruits ripen in succession over several weeks, so you can enjoy an extended harvest period. They're incredibly soft when ripe, almost like a ripe fig, so I harvest them carefully and eat them within a few days, though they do freeze beautifully for smoothies and desserts.
Hack number 8. Akebia. Akebia quinata, the chocolate vine with unique fruits. Let me introduce you to one of the most unique and underutilized edible vines that most people have never heard of, Akebia, commonly called chocolate vine because of its unusual chocolate-scented flowers. This semi-evergreen vine is hardy from zones 4 through 8 and produces these really interesting edible fruits that look like small purple sausages or pods. I planted 2 Akebia vines 4 years ago on a recommendation from a gardening friend, and I have to say, this has been one of the most fascinating plants in my collection. The vines are incredibly vigorous, easily growing 15 to 20 feet per season, and they've completely covered a section of chain link fence that was previously an eyesore. The fruits are the main edible attraction, ripening in late September and October in my Zone 7 garden. They're about 3 to 5 inches long, with a purple outer skin that splits open when ripe, revealing a translucent white flesh with a texture similar to a ripe banana and a flavor that's mildly sweet with floral notes. The taste is definitely unusual. It's not something you'd compare to any common fruit, and honestly, it's more of a curiosity than a staple food crop. But here's the cool part. The young leaves and shoots are also edible and are actually commonly eaten in Japan, where Akebia is native. I harvest the tender young shoots in spring and stir-fry them, and they have a slightly sweet, mild flavor. Last season, from my 2 vines, I harvested about 30 fruits and probably 2 pounds of edible shoots, so it's not the most productive vine on this list, but it's definitely one of the most interesting. Growing Akebia is incredibly easy, almost too easy because this vine can become invasive in some regions if not managed properly, so be aware of that before planting. I positioned my vines in a spot where I wanted aggressive coverage, and they delivered. The plants tolerate a wide range of soil conditions from full sun to partial shade, though I found they fruit better with at least 6 hours of sun. I planted them in average garden soil without any special amendments, and they took off immediately. One important note about fruiting, Akebia is self-fertile but produces much better with cross-pollination, so planting 2 different varieties or 2 seedlings rather than clones significantly improves fruit set. The flowers appear in mid to late spring with chocolate-scented blooms that are quite pretty, though not showy from a distance. The vines don't require much maintenance. I just prune them back in late winter if they've gotten out of bounds, removing about 1/3 of the oldest stems to encourage new growth. The fruits don't ripen all at once, so I check the vines every few days in late September and October, harvesting pods as they split open. If birds or squirrels discover the fruits, you might have competition, but I haven't had major issues with wildlife in my garden. The fruits don't store well, so I eat them fresh or use them immediately in fruit salads where their unique appearance adds visual interest. Hack number 9. Groundnut. Apius americana, the Native American three-season food source. This next vine is truly special because it's a native North American plant that was a crucial food source for indigenous peoples for thousands of years, and yet most modern gardeners have never heard of it. Groundnut, or Apius americana, is a perennial legume vine that's hardy from zones 3 through 9, and it produces 3 different edible parts: edible tuberous roots, edible beans, and edible flowers. I discovered groundnut 5 years ago while researching native edible plants, and I planted several tubers along my back fence. These vines have become one of my favorite permaculture additions because they're truly low maintenance and fix nitrogen in the soil, actually improving the soil for neighboring plants. The vines grow 6 to 10 feet tall, climbing by twining stems, and they produce beautiful clusters of maroon and pink flowers in midsummer that smell like cinnamon and roses. The flowers are edible with a sweet floral flavor, and I add them to salads as a gorgeous garnish. The seed pods that follow contain beans similar to lima beans that you can harvest and eat fresh or dried. But the real treasure is underground. The tubers that form on the roots look like small potatoes strung together on a chain. These tubers are the most substantial food product from the plant, and they have a flavor that's been described as a cross between a potato and a turnip with a nutty undertone. They're much more nutritious than potatoes, with 3 times the protein content. From my initial planting of 6 tubers, I now have a well-established groundnut patch, and last year I carefully harvested about 15 pounds of tubers, making sure to leave plenty in the ground for this year's growth. Growing groundnut is remarkably simple, especially compared to most of the other vines I've covered. I planted tubers in early spring, about 3 inches deep and 1 foot apart, in rich, moisture-retentive soil. Groundnuts naturally grow in woodland edges and along streams in the wild, so they prefer partial shade to full sun and consistent moisture. I planted mine along the edge of my vegetable garden where they get morning sun and afternoon shade, and I mulch heavily to keep the soil moist. The vines need support, so I gave them a simple trellis made from bamboo poles, though they'll climb whatever is available. In the first year, the vines establish and grow moderately, maybe 4 to 6 feet, but by year 2 and beyond, they fill in nicely and start flowering prolifically. The nitrogen-fixing ability is a real bonus. I've noticed that plants growing near my groundnut patch, particularly my tomatoes, seem more vigorous and productive. Harvesting the tubers is the only tricky part because you need to be careful not to harvest too much, or you'll kill the plant. I wait until fall after the foliage has died back, then I carefully dig at the edge of the planting area and follow the rhizomes, which have these tubers growing along them like beads on a string. I take about 1/3 of what I find and leave the rest to regenerate. The tubers need to be cooked, they're not edible raw, and I usually boil or roast them. The texture is dense and starchy, and they make an excellent potato substitute. One caution, some people need to eat groundnut tubers in moderation when they first try them, because they can cause digestive upset if you're not used to them, so start with small portions. Hack number 10. Chayote, Sechium edule, the productivity champion of perennial vines. This last one is the most productive perennial edible climbing vine I believe in existence. It's the vine I mentioned at the beginning that produced over 40 pounds of food from one plant in one season, and honestly, that wasn't even a particularly outstanding year for it. Chayote is a tropical vine from the squash family that's traditionally grown in Mexico and Central America, and it's perennial in zones 8 through 11, though I've successfully overwintered the tuberous roots in my Zone 7 garden with heavy mulching. The vines produce these light green pear-shaped fruits that are incredibly versatile in the kitchen, tasting like a mild, crisp squash or cucumber depending on how you prepare them. What makes chayote absolutely remarkable for vertical gardens is its vigor and productivity. Once established, typically in year 2, a single chayote vine can produce anywhere from 50 to 100 fruits in a season. My vine last year, which was in its 3rd year produced 87 fruits that averaged half a pound each, totaling about 43 pounds of food from one plant, taking up roughly 4 square feet of ground space, while climbing over 20 feet up and across my pergola. That's productivity that rivals any vegetable in my garden on a per square foot basis. Plus, the young shoots and leaves are also edible, similar to squash shoots, and the tuberous root can be eaten like a potato, though I leave mine in the ground for regrowth. Growing chayote requires understanding that it's basically a massive summer squash plant that climbs and acts as a perennial in warm climates. You don't plant seeds exactly, you plant an entire fruit. In late fall or early spring, I purchased a fresh chayote fruit from a Latin grocery store, making sure it was organic and starting to sprout, which they naturally do after a few weeks. I planted the entire fruit at a 45-degree angle, with the narrow end pointing up and the fat end buried about 4 inches deep in rich, well-amended soil at the base of a very sturdy support structure. This is crucial. Chayote vines become enormous and heavy, so your support needs to be substantial. I use my wooden pergola, which has thick posts and heavy beams. The vines need full sun, at least 8 hours, and consistent water, about 2 inches per week once established. In the first year, my vine grew to about 15 feet and produced maybe 10 fruits, but by year 2, it had fully established its massive root system and became a fruit-producing machine. The fruits appear in late summer and continue through fall until frost. I harvest them when they're about 6 to 4 inches long and still firm, though they'll continue growing to 8 inches or more. You can eat them raw, sliced thin in salads where they add crunch similar to jicama, or cooked in stir-fries, soups, stuffed and baked, pretty much any way you'd use summer squash. In late fall, before the first hard frost, I cut the vine back to about 2 feet from the ground and mulch heavily over the root zone with about 12 inches of leaves, straw, and compost. In my Zone 7 garden, this has successfully brought the plant back for 3 years now, though in colder zones you might need to dig up the tuberous root and store it indoors like a dahlia. So, there you have it. 10 incredible perennial edible climbing vines that can transform even the smallest vertical space into a productive food garden. From the tropical beauty of passion fruit to the cold hardy productivity of grapes, from the unique chocolate-scented Akebia to the absolute powerhouse production of chayote, these vines prove that you don't need a huge garden to grow a huge amount of food. Remember, the key is thinking vertically and choosing plants that match your climate zone and available space. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these 10 vines are you most excited to try in your garden? Are you going to go for the productivity champion chayote, or maybe start with something easier like Scarlet runner beans? Drop a comment below and let me know. And while you're at it, comment what country you're watching this from, so I can get a sense of where all you amazing gardeners are located around the world. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Garden Solace for more practical growing advice. Hit that bell icon so you don't miss our next video, where I'll be showing you exactly how to build a vertical trellis system for under $30 using materials from any hardware store. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Happy vertical growing, everyone!